Blackballed. Blackballed.
What is up, everybody? My name is James DeFiore, and this is Blackballed. This is the second show today on what I just made up 5 minutes ago will be called Doubleheader Monday, even though it's probably not going to happen every Monday. But listen, I have a guest tonight that, full disclosure, this person is the dad of one of my oldest and best gal pals ever. We live far away from each other now, but her dad, he impressed me when I found out that for, I think it was 38 years. I don't know why I remember that specific of a number. He worked for child welfare services and was that guy, someone that's actually making a difference in our society. And he became a first-time author after he had retired. And that book is called Caught Between Two Devils. And that guest name is Mark Creedon. Mark, how are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you, James?
I'm doing well. You know what's funny? I called you sir because you're my friend's dad. Because normally I'm just like, how are you, buddy? But it didn't feel right in this context.
Just call me Mark.
Mark, we're going to talk about the book, but I am interested in knowing what it is like, because I've wanted to be a writer since I was 11. And it's one of those occupations where you could be an accountant for 23 years and consider yourself a writer because that was your first passion kind of thing. You put out a book after you retired from, was it child welfare services? Is that what it was?
Actually, I did my first 12 years was in child welfare, but then I spent most of my career after that in family services. So I was the executive director of Catholic Family Service Peel Duffer in the last 20 years.
Right. And a super important position. I remember Laura took me to a couple of I think it was your Christmas party or end of year event or something. But you became a published author after you had retired from your career. And I just like that career path because it's unique and it shows one thing more than anything else, which is that your passion to be a writer never faded. So can you tell me, was that the plan? Was it, how long did it take you to figure out after you retired that this is what you wanted to sort of embark on?
I knew before I retired that I wanted to write this book because this book is about my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, and my wife's paternal aunt, and as forced labor. And I, for years, every January 5th, my mother-in-law, Jadwiga Paskaviches, would talk about the very strange circumstances of their wedding, how they had to do it secretly, because the Germans had banned church services. And the more I heard about this, the more I realized I need to know more about their whole experience as forced laborers. And so I did. And when I retired, the first thing I did, I always remember what Margaret Atwood said when she met somebody it was a doctor that was retiring. And she asked him what he was going to do, and he said he was going to write a novel. And her response was, well, when I retire, I'm going to become a brain surgeon. So I think the joke is that there is skill to it. It isn't just having a story or having an interest. So I went back to my alma mater, University of Toronto, and took some continuing ed courses. And I had this wonderful professor, Alexander Leggett, who basically I took the courses on how to write a novel. And I learned a lot from that. And so I had planned it.
That's a smart move as a person who struggles with structure. Like you can be taught so many different things, but things like grammar and things like the structure of a well-paced novel and all that kind of stuff is, that's the blue collar stuff that writers need to do. But recognizing that and going back to school as well, I mean, you put a lot of passion into this book. I talked to you and Laura about those moments, at Christmas or whatever it was, that where your mother-in-law would talk about these stories, and you could almost. Laura says that she used. I believe she said this, that it used to make her like teary-eyed almost, because it was just, she was told as if it just happened. There's always something really interesting when people talk about experiences that they had during the war, whether it's military or non-military, because the generalization is that people don't like to talk about that stuff because it's painful. Um, but the power and the energy behind the people that do open up about that is incredible. And was it? Did you have to pry it out of her, or was she happy to tell it? I guess my question would be.
Chris's grandfather and her grand aunt never spoke about the war in all the time I knew them. But Jadwiga, Laura's grandmother, she did. And as I say, every time it was their anniversary on January 5th, she would tell this story. So I asked if we could write a whole book about it. She was kind of intrigued. She was saying, why would anybody want to know about it? And it was kind of, I think it was ambivalent. In some ways, it was private. She didn't want to share it. But in other ways, she recognized that there was something people could learn from it. And I think the more we talked, by the time I was starting to write the story and I would interview her, she was living in a senior's home. She was blind and she was in a wheelchair. And we used to have her come out to our place, a couple of times a week, and we'd go and visit lots of times. But when she was alone, mostly what she was doing was living in her memories. So she really respected the fact and liked the fact that somebody was interested in her memories. And I convinced her that not only were her memories something good to be shared with the family, but that people in Canada could learn a lot from what her experiences were. Because I think, frankly, you would know this, most Canadians know very little about the Eastern Front of the Second World War. If they know anything about the Second World War, it's usually the Western Front. But 80% of the casualties the Germans experienced were in the Eastern Front.
Yeah, I mean, it's. Can you give us a breakdown of the story so that people, can see? Because I found it timely. The reason why I wanted to have you on the podcast now was because what was happening with Russia and Ukraine. I don't know why I thought of your book immediately, and it's not because it's exactly the same or anything, but we're having a similar. I guess the similar parallels might be just the way that it's like Russian imperialism. Is that the correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. As Mr.
So can you give us a breakdown of the book, and then maybe afterwards, we can talk about the parallels between what's happening now and what happened then?
Well, the book, as I say, is about Chris's mother and father and her paternal aunt, and they were just ordinary people living in. Two of them are living in Lithuania and one living in Poland. And when Jadwiga and Antanas finally got married, then in 1944, in April 1944, they were taken forcibly by the Germans and sent to Elbing, Germany, as forced labor. And there was nowhere to run at first. Where are we going to go? The Germans controlled thousands of kilometers around them. But by February of 1945, the Soviet army, the Red Army, was pressing on Elbing, and they sensed that the Germans were going to finally collapse, and they wanted to get out of there before the Soviets took over, because they had lived the first 2 years of the war under Soviet control, and they knew as bad as the Germans were, the Russians were worse. So they stole a truck from the Wehrmacht, stole diesel, stole tools, and together with 7 other prisoners of war and 2 German women that wanted to get out of town, plus the children of the 2 German women, and they started heading for Bavaria, because Antanas correctly figured out that Bavaria would be liberated by the Americans or the Canadians or the French or the British, and not by the Soviets. And so the story is really about them.
What is the math behind? Because I wouldn't have known that. That seems very strategic. What was the math behind her deciding that would be liberated by the Allies?
I honestly don't know, and neither did Jadwiga. This was a decision that Antanas made, and he was quite private. But there were lots of other Lithuanians in the camp. Some of the German guards were friendly with them. Not all the Germans were bestial. Some of them were quite good. And so basically piecing this piece of information together, they sensed that the Soviets were more to the northeast and that Bavaria being more to the southwest would be more favorable to attend to.
So they stole the truck. Like you don't want to. I don't. You know what? I don't know how it works. I'm a writer. And I'm interviewing a writer, and I'm like, do I ask him to expand on the
You
plot
can
line
ask
any more than
anything.
that?
I'm not worried about it.
Well, because it's historical fiction, and because the story comes from your wife's family, like I think I feel like I'm sitting at the table with you and Laura and your mother-in-law and your mom and your wife and just like listening to the story. So my next question would be, if I was in that setting, would be, what happened after they stole the truck? How did they get through, and where did they end up?
This was February in one of the coldest winters in record in Europe. So they had several problems. They had to not only avoid SS, stops and checkpoints. They had to find shelter. They had to find food. They had to find diesel. So they were constantly on. They were lucky the first night they stumbled on a farm that had been evacuated by the farmers because they were afraid of the Red Army was going to come there. So they found food. They found diesel and everything. But this was something they constantly had to work on. There was one time when they were trying to go up a steep hill in this old truck, and it wouldn't make it. They had like all 10 of them behind pushing this truck to get it up, while Antanas was doing his best to keep it on the road. So, and of course, some nights they had to sleep overnight in the truck when it was like minus 20 degrees. So they really had to learn how to work together as a team, how to trust one another, and rely on their faith that they could make it.
And so let's just, first of all, a lot of people don't know, because we don't really learn much about it in school, about the Russian presence and then atrocities after Germany was defeated. There's a pretty famous book, I think, called "Woman in Berlin," and it's written by an anonymous author, talking about how German women were treated when once Russia was in charge of the streets and everything, and it was just brutal. And it goes to that old adage where there's no good guys in war often. Obviously in some cases they're a little bit different, but there's always, war's bloody and war's awful and war's really bad. And it's just like, even if you're on the side that's supposed to be the good guys, there's a lot of bad stuff happening. So what parallels do you see, if any, between the conflict between Russia and Ukraine right now and that kind of struggle that you describe in your book, Caught Between Two Devils?
There are tremendous parallels. First of all, when the Russians were, pushing the Germans back, the Nazis, that was great. But they had full intention of occupying many of the countries that they freed, as opposed to the Americans, the British, or French, where they liberated countries, but then left them to run their own democracies. This was not what the Soviet had in mind. They just wanted to extend their empire, and that's certainly what's happening in Ukraine today. Also, you mentioned about the atrocities. Well, we've heard of the atrocities that the current Russians are doing with, torture, killing, raping of women. As the latter days of the war, you could find some German women that had been raped by a British or a Canadian or an American soldier. But if they were caught, if they were found out, they would be court-martialed and imprisoned for it. On the other hand, in Eastern Germany, you were hard-pressed to find a German adult woman that hadn't been raped by a Soviet soldier, because it was coming as an order from the top. Stalin was using it as a weapon of war, and Putin is using it as a weapon of war.
Yeah, it's so brutal. I can't even it's hard for me to even fathom, to weaponize that kind of horrific act. And that we haven't, apparently, when I say we, I don't even mean the royal we. And then some militaries still haven't learned that lesson somehow. We like to talk. I like to talk about how the world's really, come a long way, but in many ways it hasn't. After you knew the story and you were plotting out the book and you figured it out, was there any difficulties trying to figure out where you would end it? I know this is a bizarre question, but I hate endings more than anything.
Yeah,
I don't like ending newspaper articles or haikus. I don't like it. I feel like there could be everything's a choose your own adventure. In a way.
Yeah. No, it's funny. I was struggling with that myself because I've read lots of novels that I liked the novel but didn't like the ending. But I wanted it to be on a hopeful and optimistic note. And I always remember one of the other stories that Jadwiga would talk about is when they first got to Union Station in Toronto, and they were met by Maria, who had been in Canada for a year already, working at St. Joseph's Hospital, just basically cleaning, washing dishes. She had a flat for them ready for them to move into. And how excited they were. They had like about $25 between Antanas Jadwiga and Chris's brother, Peter, was 2 years old, and he was there too. But just to be in a free country, be in a country that wasn't bombed out, be in a country that was hopeful, be in a country that was on the rebound. Antanas literally got down on the ground on the grass around Union Station and kissed the grass. And they were just so thrilled to be there. So that's how I ended it.
Imagine not being able to tell that your story is an epic journey and like amazingly interesting, because I had a brother-in-law whose dad was in the Hitler Youth, and he described it like, the SS or whoever would come to your house, to a German citizen's house or whatever, and ask you, and sort of like, and staring at you like, will your children be a part of the Hitler Youth? And basically everyone said yes, because if they didn't, then you would pay in one way or another. You would pay even if you were a German citizen. So they went to Prague to be stationed at the Hitler Youth camp there. And when the Allies started to win, the kids at this camp were abandoned by the soldiers that were sent there to run it. And my brother-in-law's dad, his brother and sister then walked from Prague to Berlin when they were like 11 and 10 or something, and lived off of the root cellar food that they could sneak. And it was always salami and cheese. For whatever reason, it was always salami and cheese.
Bad.
And when you know what? I've lived in bachelor apartments where it was ramen noodles and bread. So, but they got back to Germany, and the Allies had, like, the city was basically leveled, and they went to their street, and there was one house left standing, and it was their house. And they went to the back, and their parents were celebrating the birthday of the sister who just arrived with salami and cheese.
Wow.
You know what I mean? And so I guess I'm asking about humanizing people that are part of the side that is the aggressor. Because sometimes I'm reading things from media about, sometimes I think all we have is language. It's mathematical. It should be distributed in an equal way, because that's, what else do we have but language? And it feels like Russia's government doing the heinous things that they're doing. I don't see much of a effort to sort of separate the people from the government.
Maybe not, because one of the things I tried very hard in the book was to separate the people from the government. One of the main characters in the book is Private Bauer, who was one of the guards at the camp they were in, but eventually became the boyfriend of Chris's aunt. He is one of the ones who got them papers to allow them, so that when they're out and they hit a checkpoint, they wouldn't be returned to the camp as prisoners again. False papers, of course. He was a wonderful kind of person. They had a German priest when they got to Bavaria that took them in and introduced them to the mayor and got them jobs and places to live. When you talk about the Hitler Youth, well, actually, Dachau, the first inhabitants of Dachau were Germans that resisted Hitler. The only time that they actually got stopped by a German patrol when they escaped from the camp was actually by a group of Hitler Youth. They got pulled over, and they thought they were really in big trouble. And when their leader came over, they realized he was probably 15, and his fellow troops were like 14-year-olds. And they actually felt sorry for them. So it's and for that matter, even though the Russians come out of the book looking even worse than the Germans, there were some good Russian characters. There's the one that brought a message to Jadwiga from Antanas. There was all the Russians weren't bad, and of course there was Pavel, who was a prisoner himself, who was a prisoner of war of the Germans because of Operation Barbarossa, and he was one of the colleagues of Jadwiga. So there's good and bad on every side.
Yeah, and I bet when you were writing it, especially because the story is about your wife's family, that was there a stress attached to making sure the accuracy was like beyond reproach? Like, I mean, the obvious answer is yes, but it's historical fiction because certain things have to be altered just to like flow the story and
Sure,
everything.
sure.
But how obsessed were you with getting everything as accurate as you possibly could? Because I would be going crazy because I'm not that organized, you know?
Well, I resist being obsessive compulsive,
Mm.
but I would say 90% of the things I talked about Jadwiga and Tanis and Maria were accurate. Um, where I strayed and why I made it a novel rather than a memoir, which gave me more latitude, is because of the colleagues they had in the camp. Some of them are Ukrainian, some of them were Belarus. So one of them, as I mentioned, was Russian. One of them was actually German. Another one was ironically American. Uh, Jadwiga couldn't really remember too many like names and details. So I took as much information from Jadwiga as I could about these people. But then Antanas Shaleka, who's a well-known author, has written some great books. He told me that he says, you might think you know a lot about World War II, but you only know about the Western Front. And he gave me this terrific bibliography of books about the Eastern Front. So I learned a lot about, uh, quintessential stories from the Ukraine, from Belarus, from Russia, from Germany. And so when I was doing characters, I would write their backstories, being faithful to things that had actually happened.
Oh,
So
okay.
with those characters, I strayed. With the main three characters, I stayed pretty close to the reality.
Um, were you a writer when you were younger, like in college and high school and stuff like that? Did you have any like tangible experience to speak of before you embarked on your
Not
career?
not not really. I mean, English was always a good subject for me, as was history. But I guess the closest I got was about 10 years before I retired. I heard a story from someone with regard to a person who had a strange disorder of lacking testosterone. And this person grew to be like about almost 7 feet tall, but very skinny. And he was working in a laboring kind of job and he couldn't keep up. And so he started taking doses of testosterone and it did everything he wanted. He got to be big and strong and all kinds of things. But then before, he'd always been a gentle kind of person. And all of a sudden in the pubs, instead of being a passive observer of what was going on, he started getting into fights and he almost crippled. Well, he did cripple one person. And then he had demanded the doctor take him off the testosterone. So this story, when I was writing this, would be during Christmas holidays, and Chris would be saying, "We got to go see our friends, now." And I say, just a minute," because all of a sudden it was like,
You're such a natural writer, Mark.
yeah, it
Yeah, I'll
was,
be
it
there
was,
in a
like,
minute. Just
it
relax.
was like I was watching the most interesting movie I'd ever seen, and I was creating it. It was I could alter it. It was like a really interesting kind of experience. And when I was writing about Chris's parents, I'm an extrovert. And I thought it's going to be really interesting to be all alone and in my office just writing this thing for hours. Maybe this isn't going to be so good. I loved it because I felt like I was there with Antanas, Jadwiga, and Maria, and I just couldn't be seen. But I was there in the room when they were having their discussions, when they were having their struggles, when they were having to do all these things. And at a time when they were much younger than I ever met them, because when I met them, they were in their 50s already. Now I'm writing about them when they're in their 20s. So
Yeah,
it was never boring. It was never lonely. I loved it.
that's actually really good because you're embarking. It doesn't even sound like it's intentional, which is even better. But you're embarking on almost like a creative visualization strategy
Hmm.
to immerse yourself in this story, and like it really worked. I'm kind of jealous. I'm a little pissed off that you made it look so easy because you, I know you went to
Well,
school, but you nailed it on your first go, and I'm just
well,
like, you
James,
gotta
if it
write
makes you
anything.
feel any better, I remember my
Yeah.
first class, and Alexander always said it was great at getting the other students to contribute. And so you'd have an assignment, and you'd write certain something and bring it. And I remember I thought I had everybody else in the class was in their 20s, and I was in my 60s, and they were all better writers than me. But I had a story. I really had this fantastic story. I had a better story than them. They had better writing skills. But I was there to get the writing skills. So first time I presented it, I thought I was going to get the Pulitzer Prize. I thought I was going to get a standing ovation.
I love the confidence. I love it.
There was yeah, a little overconfident, but there was a sort of stunned silence until finally one of the students said, "Well, you know, it's a little dense." I had no idea what they meant by that, but as it turned out, what they meant was I had been great at putting in the plot, but I hadn't described what the characters looked like. I hadn't described what the surroundings were like. I hadn't got into much dialogue. I hadn't got into character development. I was just plot oriented. So basically, through those courses, I learned a lot. And one of the things you have to learn is people, when they're giving you, criticism, it's coming from a loving place. They're not trying to hurt you. They're trying to help you. And so as long as you take it with that in mind, it really helped me to become a better writer.
I like criticism better than throwaway compliments,
Yeah,
especially if
yeah.
someone that I'm like close, not someone that I'm close. I tend not to send anything to anyone that I'm really close to because it's a trap. Like, like, but there's nothing worse than whoever you send it to going, it's great. Yeah, good job. I'd rather know it's a little disjointed when you're executing the rising action in Poland, and I think you really need to work on that. That would be like, okay, yes, thank you, which is hilarious because I can't take criticism in virtually any other aspect of my life except for the one thing I care about the most, right?
Well, that's good.
Yeah. Are you already working on anything next? Like, are you
Yeah.
going to continue? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I keep getting distracted because I'm getting certain other things that I'm involved in. I do a lot of volunteer work on various committees. But what I'm trying to focus on is a book about my parents and their parents, and it's called Country Mouse, City Mouse, simply because my father came from the country and my mother was born here in Toronto. And if you look at Canadian history in the first, say, 50 years of the 20th century, the four biggest things that affected the average person was the First World War, the Spanish flu, the Great Depression, and the Second World War. In my family, the two parts of the family, the McDonoughs and the Creedons, were directly affected by all of those things. So
yeah, which is a really small time frame when you think about it. Like, it's like it would be like all of that stuff happening from 1990 to now, or something like that, right? Like,
yeah, oh yeah, it was
that is a lot. Like, we're still getting over 9/11, and I'm not saying that to be cheeky. I'm, there's still, let's put it in a more sophisticated way. There's still reverberations from that day that are felt now in policy, in societal fabrics, and how we get along with people that aren't like us or whatever. Two world wars, the Spanish flu, and what was the last one?
The Great Depression.
The Great Depression. That is like a lot of stress packed into 30, 35 years.
Oh yeah.
Is this a niche? Are you writing about people's parents? Because that could be a good jump off to like...
Well, they're my parents, but
Yeah.
but because I know they say writers should write about what you know, at least at the beginning. The Spanish flu, for example, COVID-19 has been terrible, but the Spanish flu, there were 500 million people got it worldwide at a time when the world's population was only 1.5 billion people. So it was basically 1 out of 3 people, and lots of them died. They didn't have vaccines like we have now. They did social distancing. They did a lot of other things. But my grandfather on my father's side, he got the Spanish flu. And then he also, while he was fighting it off, he contracted tuberculosis of the spine from the milk of the cows that they raised. The reason that nobody else in the family got it is because their own immune systems were strong and they fought it off. He was fighting the Spanish flu. His immune system was compromised. He got this horrible disease, tuberculosis of the spine, which basically ate away his spine.
Was that because there wasn't pasteurized? Is it like raw milk?
That's correct.
Is that the idea?
That's correct. It was a liberal government in the 1930s that finally passed legislation to pasteurize milk.
That's interesting. There's still people that fight for that. Like, it's the greatest fight ever.
Yeah.
Like, there's raw milk activists.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny. I met one once a few years ago around here. I live in Killaloe near Barry's Bay in the Madawaska Valley. And I met this gentleman who is, I was doing a radio show for a small amount of time at the local radio station. And he we were sitting, eating or drinking coffee at my friend Peter Benner's building that he owned. He passed away last year. Rest in peace, Peter. But he slides this pamphlet onto the table. It's all serious, right? It's really serious space. And I look at it and it's like the government is oppressing us by not allowing us to drink raw milk. And I'm like, oh, that is the most first world problem I've ever heard. But also it wasn't true. You can drink the raw milk as much as you want. You can't sell it.
That's right.
So he didn't even know his own
Rights.
Yeah, his own issue. Yeah,
I
but
think
that's
with raw milk is if you're really good at it and careful and do a lot of the right things, it can be safe. But if you start doing it province wide, there's going to be lots of mistakes, and there's going to be
like,
lots.
does boiling really take away the flavor of raw milk? Is that? I'm just trying to figure out what the.
I don't know.
Yeah. Sorry. Why aren't you an expert in raw milk, Mark? What's going on? I thought you were preparing for the podcast. No, I'm just kidding. Now we talked a little bit. I only want to talk about this because we talked a little bit about how this was your first book. I'm currently writing my first book for a publisher, and how the Canadian market is really weird to me. But and what constitutes a bestseller is also very odd to me. It's a pretty low number. I think it's like 500 or something like that.
That's correct.
You may not know the answer to this. I certainly don't know the answer to this. But is our industry, I guess you want to call it, the fiction and nonfiction book industry in Canada, 500 for a bestseller seems condescending. Like it doesn't feel right. It's like, it's like getting 5 runs at the beginning of a baseball game because you aren't good as the other people. I just, I don't want to. I'm not speaking ill of the industry. I know almost nothing about it, even though I'm a published or about to be published writer. But was there any, here, let me ask you this. Was there anything about the industry itself that you found, like, I don't want you to name names of anybody that made you mad or whatever, but was there anything that was like built in frustrating about the process with, the publisher?
One of the things I found strange.
Can you throw your publisher under the bus for me? I'm just kidding. Shout out to Iguana Books.
No, Iguana Books has been great to me. But one of the things I found interesting was it was harder to find an agent than it was to find a publisher. Not that it was easy. I must have written to about 70 different publishers before I got 2 positive responses. But I thought getting an agent wouldn't be that difficult, and then they would help me to find a publisher, but it turned out to be an impossible task for me.
Yeah, I've never even thought of the concept of finding an agent. I just
don't bother.
Yeah, like exactly. I don't really like. I have a bunch of I have experience in nothing that has anything to do with writing books. So I don't know what an agent would actually do for me. But I'm told by writers, published authors, and whatnot that that you become, and I think you did this. I think you're a perfect example of this, actually. You treat it almost like an entrepreneurial endeavor.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like you took training, right? In a sense, you upped your skill set by going and taking that course. Because I asked my a friend of mine who's a fairly well-known journalist and author. I call him and I'm like, yeah, I'm having a lot of trouble here. Do you have any advice? Because I just want to like throw my computer against the wall, and the publisher is real. The publisher is telling me his vision, and I'm not sure if I want to do his vision. He's like, "Are you when you talk to the publisher, are you making sure that you follow what his vision is to make sure you give him what he wants?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I am." He's like, "Yeah, don't do that ever." So his advice is like, nod politely to the publisher. Then do it your own way, and if he likes it, he'll just think it was his, leadership that got you there. But what do you care? So, it's an interesting industry.
Well, you certainly have to be true to yourself. But I not only did I take 3 courses at University of Toronto, but I also shared the work with Alexandra Leggett, my professor. I actually hired her to be my. I never realized there was different kinds of editing until I did this. I always thought editing was just looking at grammar and spelling and things like that. Well, that's the last form of editing. The first one is basically strategic. Are you focusing on the right
and flow and all that? Yeah.
Is the book too long? Is it too short? Is it, do you want to develop this more or that less? Kind of. The second one is more to do with things like more writing styles. You got to work on what verbs you're using. You got to do better character development. Your dialogue needs to be improved. And only the last form is, the grammar, the spelling, that kind of thing. So I got it run by, well, first of all, Alexander Leggett really helped me a lot at the beginning.
Hmm.
And then Antanas Shaleka, he read it, and he was so funny because it was like Alexander was like your stereotypical mother love. She would just reinforce the positive things and very gently point out the constructive criticism and everything like that.
Yeah.
Antanas was your stereotypical stern father love. He read the book 3 times. He did for me, and then he said to me, he says, "Most of this book is bullshit." He says, "But that's a real golden kernels that that could be developed." The book was like, I forget how many long. It was about 400 pages long. He said the first thing you got to do is cut it in half, which I did. I got it to 230 pages. But he was really good. And then he gave me some very detailed kind of things. Then I took it to Jan Zaverby, and she was the one, if you notice my book, that I have little blurbs of history at the beginning to give
Yes.
set what's
I
happening.
liked that. It was helpful. Yeah.
It was so helpful because, as I said, when I was in high school, my 2 best subjects were English and history, and I actually had the top marks in my high school, and they were going to give me an award for that, but I had to choose which one, and it was a hard choice because I didn't know which one I preferred, and it kept showing itself up in the novel. So finally, somebody had to give me the advice that you're writing story here. The history is important, but the story comes first. And she gave me the idea. She said, if you really want to get some context history, the best way is through what the characters say or do. But there's some things that characters didn't know, but it would be good for the audience to know, the readers to know. So she said, I'll let you write 2 or 3 sentences at the beginning of each chapter, but it's got to be every chapter, not just 1 or 2 chapters, every chapter. And I did that, except I violated a couple of times. Sometimes it was 4 or 5 sentences, but
Yeah.
that really helped me. A lot of people, especially people that didn't necessarily know a lot about World War II history, found that really good because it contextualized things.
Yeah, I was just going to say the contextualization that would carry with it would also be so much easier, or you would be more willing to digest it because it's not in the form of a footnote that's in tiny print on the bottom of the page.
Yeah, that's
which
right.
I avoid. I don't even look at that sometimes.
No, there's no footnotes.
Yeah, no. So this is like a really good format. Listen, when we're going to wrap up, but I love talking to you, first of all, because I remember when Laura told me that you wrote a book, and I was just like, it made me feel like hopeful that one day I would be able to write one too. Like you were kind of inspiring, like the story. And I know that like your family is like, in the best way, like a loving, emotional kind of family. Like, and the specialness, I'm a writer, but you know what I mean? Like that attached to the story because of where it came from and stuff. Like it's almost tactile. Like when I hear you talk about it, when I hear Laura talk about it in the past, it was just like you've taken almost like the family tradition of hearing about this amazing story, and you immortalized it in a way. Like it's there now for other people to read. That is the kind of rewarding part of writing that is also very rare. You know, like usually, you know, the work that you feel the best about isn't necessarily the personal work. In fact, it's almost always the opposite. You know, The Old Man and the Sea. I mean, even Hemingway didn't like that book. You know, like, and it's just like, you know, so yeah, it's amazing because you worked really hard. You're fortunate, but you captained your own ship. You know, I think that you could teach like a master class or do a TED talk about about getting your book out there and being confident about it, because yeah,
But James,
a lot of writers don't have the humility to go back to school even, you know.
James, you mentioned Laura. One of the best rewards I ever had was that the kids would all hear about the story about the wedding, but that's all they'd hear. I knew there was many other stories behind that story, and I therefore put it together in the novel. And my very first reading was in a parish hall. There was about 50, 60 people, mostly my friends, that were there. But Laura got up and said to me a personal thank you. She said, for putting this together so that I now know the history of these people that I knew and loved all my life, but never knew much about them before they ever came to Canada. And
Wow.
thank you for doing it.
And I can see the emotion too, because like it's almost like spiritual generational telephone. You know,
Mm-hmm.
like your mother-in-law's like telling you the story, the matriarch of the family is telling you the story.
Yeah.
You're the conduit delivering it to, the next generation. I think, and it's so, I've never really thought to myself, I think the process of this book is just as beautiful as the book itself. And I think that's really what I'm saying.
Oh, thank you.
No problem. So, I would like to have you back when you're done your story about the testosterone, man. Are you still working on that?
I've done the testosterone one. It's a
Oh,
short
you finished
story.
it?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
It got published on. Let's see, it was on a British one. What was it called? I can't remember what the site was.
Oh, that's
Fiction,
okay. Well, I'll
fiction,
put a link in. Yeah.
fiction on the web .uk ca or not ca .com.
And
Fiction
so,
on
and what do you have an expectation of when your next project might be done?
the,
I love asking a writer that.
I'm
You're
a
in
slow
a work
writer.
in progress. Tell me exactly when you're going to be finished. It's like,
I'd say probably 3 years.
3
It
years,
took
eh?
6 years to write Caught Between Two Devils. So between the
Well,
interviewing, 5 years to write it and then another year to find a publisher.
well, as you say, the book is called Caught Between Two Devils. My library ordered it as well. I think
Yes.
anyone out there that is interested in the conflict right now from through a historical lens would want to read this. I also live in a very Polish area, and
Yes.
when you did that talk at the library with us, there was I had a lot of people coming up after that, telling me that that it was totally unexpected to hear from something like this, and yeah, so I think it's timely, and I think it's great work, and because it comes from such a good pure emotional place, it resonates on the pages. So I encourage anyone out there to hit Amazon and to find his book.
James,
And,
if I can
yeah.
just put it in, it's simply people can get it on Amazon.ca books. They can also
Yes.
get it in your library. They can also get it in the Toronto Public Library, and they can also get it in the Burlington Public Library.
Well, we love it at our library. It's a really popular book. Like people
good.
have, it's one of those
Good.
books where it's like, we've had to replace the due date slip once already. So that's great. You know what I mean? Mark
good.
Creedon, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, James.
Okay. You have a good night, sir. Mark Creedon, he's such a good guy. And I kind of look up to him because of the story of how he got his book out. So I was happy to have him as a guest. And tomorrow on Blackballed at 6:30, I don't think I'm going to do too many of these double headers because I am mentally just completely wiped out. But tomorrow we have Max Fawcett. Thursday we have Steve Paikin. And then next week, on the 24th, we have this gentleman, Linwood Barclay. His new book is called Take Your Breath Away. And in between, I don't know, maybe some rappers. I'm working on it. But we'll see you then. And thanks for joining us. Bye.
Blackballed. 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 Blackballed.